إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. Under the subtitle Science and the Supernatural, Explanation and Its Enemy, Dawkins proceeds to say, I quote, "So that is reality, and that is how we can know whether something is real or not. Each chapter of this book is going to be about one particular aspect of reality. The sun, for instance, or earthquakes, or rainbows, or the many different kinds of animals. I want now to turn to the other word of my title, magic. Magic is a slippery word. It is commonly used in three different ways, and the first thing I must do is distinguish between them. I'll call the first one supernatural magic, the second one stage magic, and the third one, which is my favorite meaning and the one I intend in my title, poetic magic. Supernatural magic is the kind of magic we find in myths and fairy tales. In miracles too, though I shall leave those to one side for now and return to them in the final chapter. It's the magic of Aladdin's lamp, of wizard spells, of the Brothers Grimm, of Hans Christian Andersen, and of J.K. Rowling. It's the fictional magic of a witch casting a spell and turning a prince into a frog, or a fairy godmother changing a pumpkin into a gleaming coach. These are the stories we all remember with fondness from our childhood, and many of us still enjoy when served up in a traditional Christmas pantomime. But we all know this kind of magic is just fiction and does not happen in reality." End quote. Now, having stated a doctrine of extreme naturalism on what reality is and can or cannot be, and how we can come to know anything about it, both the ontology of extreme naturalism and its epistemology in technical terms, it follows naturally that anything that can be classified as supernatural or supranatural would immediately qualify ipso facto as myth, fairy tale, fiction, or simply unreal. Alright, it would thus be deemed the enemy of explanation, as he states in the subtitle. If by explanation you mean making causal claims about events in reality that are themselves justifiable as parts of reality, then obviously whichever way you choose to define reality should positively determine what kinds of causal claims are plausible or justifiable to you as explanations, and which are not. We've shown that defining reality as nature, nothing more, is not only unwarranted and unjustifiable, it's actually outstandingly false. For starters, it's not a definition implied by the linguistic use of either of the words reality or nature. Reality, when used to express anything other than a thought or a mental condition, simply means that which actually exists outside of our minds, regardless of whether or not we know about it, or for that matter, can know about it at all. Now, obviously, and in principle, nobody needs to be told what reality is, or given as a word, as a linguistic term, what the word means, or given a specific definition of it. We say something is real, we mean it's truly there. It's real. It does exist. Alright? So why does anybody feel or think they need such a definition as the one sketched by Dawkins here in the previous section of this book? Not because their minds are working properly, as I have endeavored to show in the previous lectures. No, the Greek Academy simply agreed in sheer methodological sophistry that in order to be justified in anything you know, anything at all, then you need to start by conjuring up some theory about existence qua existence, about things outside of your mind, what warrants them coming into being, if they did at all come into being, and how an existing thing as such acquires any attributes at all, be it definitive of its ideal essence or otherwise. A theory of ontology should just classify existing things, all things in existence, actually and potentially, in terms of what attributes can be, in terms of rational contingency, can be ascribed to them. And what attributes cannot. Now, the sophistry here is in addressing all existing things as the subject matter of a single theory, a characterizing theory, or explanatory theory of how things be, or why they have attributes at all. And since a philosopher cannot afford to talk about things in the outside world without making it at least look as though his thought applies to observable things around us, one way or another, it followed that the only way a single theory could be proposed to cover all things in reality with some characterization or explanation of them being in existence with whatever attributes they have was to propose a universal analogy to things we know and observe, such that the theory would readily be praised as explaining what we observe. Okay? After all, if I claim, for example, that all things in existence outside of my mind are in fact there because they are composed of two discrete components built together, A and B, and it is component B that differs in every one of them, thereby making it identifiable as a different distinct thing with different attributes from anything else, then I can easily propose my theory as an explanation for why anything is the way it is in our human experience. The sky above us is blue, for example, because the property of being blue is the way component B is like in this substance filling the expanse of the sky above us. Whatever that substance may be, all distinct properties that make us identify it as a substance in distinction from other substances would thus be explained as being the way they are rather than otherwise due to the way that component B is, okay? That same component must be different, however, in many ways, as it manifests in other substances like earth, for example, or water. It would be, as the theory would have it, the ultimate reason why anything differs from anything in anything at all. So not only would it provide a solid ground for a profound knowledge claim about the reality of observable things, whatever they are, wherever or whenever, they would give the philosopher something profound to say about all things, observable and otherwise, all thanks to a simple, childish, one might say, analogy to the way that we find some kinds of observable things to be composed in our experience. It's basically a brilliant trick that is designed to fool people into believing that once a philosopher acquires such a theory, then nothing can exist without being subject to it, without passing its litmus test, so to speak. But obviously, nobody actually knows or can know that all things in existence are composed of those two types of components, or that all things unobservable have been composed from anything at all. As a matter of fact, we know this to be decidedly false, not just due to scripture, but due to innate reason as well. We know for a necessary truth, a basic belief that does not require rational justification, a belief that is every bit as self-evident to us as the fact that the world itself exists, that the sole source of all existence must be an uncaused cause, an uncreated creator. We know that for a self-evident fact. Obviously, it is because a ridiculous regress of causes could leave us with the impossibility of anything existing at all. Not because of that, but this is one way of arguing against such a ridiculous claim that this might be false, that this belief might be false. So to claim that all things in existence are there and have the attributes that they have because they are composed from A and B, whatever those are, in some point of history, is to make a ridiculously sophist irrational claim from the word go. The query itself is sophist and unacceptable. The question, why does anything at all exist rather than not, is not a big question that should provoke thought and appropriation, brothers and sisters. No, it's actually a sophist question that should be ridiculed and dismissed as an outrage, a red herring brought about by people who systematically employed their cognitive faculties where they should not be employed. Okay. It makes perfect sense to ask, why does X, a particular type of existing things that are subject to our experience, have the natures or properties that they do? In which case, we would engage in proper induction to explore certain causal links and connections that pertain to the way it is regularly affected by other things in our experience and the way it affects them. This includes, of course, the effects of different methods of decomposing or dismantling things of type X into smaller parts or building it up from components of other types combined together. Okay, the question is only plausible and fruitful, productive of justifiable knowledge, if such is the scope of its subject matter. However, this is hardly the case if the question is spelled out as such. Why does anything at all have the natures or properties that it does? This can hardly be the case here. The first question is a reasonable, feasible question in terms of scope and epistemic warrant. We can, in principle, track down repeated causes thereby deduce causation and correlation with good probability, one that serves our practical purposes just fine. Induction, which is our only proper observational route for explanation or of observable events, and deduction of causal regularities with respect to both intrinsic and extrinsic properties of observable things, including, of course, compositional or combinational properties of natures, is limited by necessity by the farthest reach of our accumulated human experience. So to assume an analogy to observables in nature's properties, compositions, origins, or the likes as an explanation for all existing things is to violate the epistemic warrant for both analogy and induction in their very principle. We cannot conclude from any sensible, justifiable analogy that all things are composed of smaller things that have been put together to form a greater whole, just because we've experienced composing big things from smaller things that we put together in a certain designed order. The way we create new things, and this is only but one way that we do so, by the way, is not necessarily the way that all created things have come to be, much less all things in existence. And yes, there are created things on one hand, and there is the creator of those things on the other. This is not a metaphysical categorization arbitrarily chosen by some philosopher that we're following here. It's a basic belief, in par with our belief that our other minds exist outside of our own, or that the past did in fact happen as we remember it, or that contradiction is false, or the likes. So any analogy that dismisses or overlooks the necessary ontological distinction between the world of the unseen, عالم الغيب, and the world of the observable, of the observables, عالم الشهادة, in its premise, is a sophist, unacceptable analogy because it violates the reasonable bounds and limits of both human analogy and human reason. Okay. The Greek Academy taught its students, however, to start learning about the world by assuming everything to be similar in certain natures and constitutions and in the fundamental cause for existence or its raison d'etre. And that's how we come to learn about it at all, about anything. Okay? Everything must be in principle analogizable to anything else, to everything else, in certain aspects of the way that they work or of what explains them being the way that they are, rather than otherwise. Okay, propose such universal theory, an all-encompassing theory, on the natures of all that exists per se, and on what makes things different from each other as such, at some fundamental level, regardless of whether or not that level can be reached through observation and sensory investigation in even the most observable of things, or it cannot. And then use your reason to infer from that theory, once you've made it, whether or not the existence of such a being as the maker can indeed be demonstrated, and if so, what attributes can or cannot be reasonably ascribed to it. Okay? To a Greek philosopher, this was the only reasonable way to know that such a being does in fact exist in reality, if at all. Yet it's also a surefire way to render his existence as nothing more than an impossible fantasy, one that can only exist in the mind, not in reality. This is because if you dismiss the rationally necessary distinction we just pointed out and start from the fallacious, pretentious claim that you don't actually know that you've been created at all, or that there really is any reason to assume that something exists out there that is not to be analogized to anything we know in its nature or in the reason why it is the way that it is, then whatever theory of existence or metaphysics you make up for yourself will have already presupposed the non-existence of your maker. Okay? So to assume or expect or claim that such a theory might in fact imply his existence in reality outside of your mind is to commit a fallacy of circularity. You start with assuming that X doesn't exist. You build an analogy or a theoretical model that encompasses all of existing things, dismissing it, of course, dismissing X, based on the assumption that everything in existence is alike, or to use a familiar terminology, everything is natural. Then you seek to deduce from that model that X or something like it does indeed exist. Sounds familiar? Yeah, exactly. That's precisely what people of Kalam do, علم الكلام, and of course apologetics in Western theology. Most philosophers do it too, one way or another, except a philosopher is usually not concerned by the ultimate negation of his existence or of all his attributes due to such a sophist, outrageous exercise of irrationality. A mutakallim, however, is concerned. Or to put it in milder terms, a philosopher following that tradition does not feel threatened by the social necessity of observing all the major religious tenets embraced by the community he was born into, unlike the mutakallim. okay? Which is reflected clearly in the very definition of kalam, commonly endorsed in most textbooks of mutakallimin. Kalam is essentially the craft of philosophizing, under the Greek tradition outlined above, to demonstrate the validity of the ultimate foundations of religion, the ultimate foundation, basically the existence of the Maker, while paying heed to the major tenets of Islam, while making sure we don't end up falling out of Islam while we do it. Which is why all sects of Kalam have fallen victim to ta'atil, the negation of Allah's attributes to varying extents. Because if you swallow a Greek theory that proposes to explain why existing things as such have attributes at all and why they differ from each other in their qualities, then whatever analogy the theory puts forth, and in that case it would be the arad or al-a'rad, would subsume everything that can be considered a real attribute existing in reality by natures of created things. In explaining them by natures of created things, which in turn should, reasonably enough, leave any uncreated maker the mutakallim seeks to prove building on such a theory void of any and all attributes. mu'attal an kulli sifa. So even such sects of kalam that claim to be muthbita al-sifat, they are required by entailment from the theory of arad, nadariyat al-a'rad, upon which they established knowledge that the world began to exist at all, to deny any and all attributes, just like the philosophers they debated with. Okay. Now, we're not here to discuss what kalam is or what it is not, though, so I should not digress any further. The point I'm establishing here, brothers and sisters, is that the Greek tradition in thinking and theorizing about the world is fundamentally fallacious. Because to put it simply, and as bluntly as can be, there is no sense in thinking about the world in its entirety as such in such a manner. It's fundamentally irrational to pose questions about the world at large or about all of existence, which is even worse, as you've shown, and set out to deduce an answer to such questions from some arbitrary analogy you make up for yourself. So if the Greek tradition is indeed flawed, then what's the reasonable proper way to start looking at the world and understanding reality through our senses? The answer is obvious. Don't overreach with your head from the start. Okay? Don't claim the ability to answer such cosmic questions on your own as a human being, because you cannot. I repeat, you cannot. Anybody who tells you otherwise is fooling you. Period. We can't know something about everything that exists in reality by looking into the stuff that we observe around us. The only proper way to conclude Plato's an allegory of the cave, brothers and sisters, is to say that instead of accepting his natural limits and making the best use of his time under those constraints of his being, of his very being, the philosopher decided not to break free from them as he claimed he could, because obviously he cannot. Instead, he decided to sit back, close his eyes, and imagine what the outside world might look like, given the only sensual experience he's ever had as a prisoner in that cave like everybody else. So, in a spark of brilliance, he has his eureka moment, opens his eyes in delight and declares, "Oh, I got it, guys. I know what's out there. It's been revealed to me. I've seen it in my mind. I know what's beyond the walls of the cave." In their excitement, many of the poor people who heard him couldn't help but ask, "Really? Enlighten us then. What did you see?" So he sat up, assuming the position of prophethood, and his revelation was thus: "There is nothing but rocks, nothing existing outside of this cave but more rocks, of the very same kind we see, surrounding us from all directions. An infinite universe of solid, continuous rock, in all directions, with perhaps a statistical possibility of there being other caves like ours, larger or smaller, buried somewhere in that infinite block of rock within which our kind is confined. So maybe if we manage to dig in any direction we pick long enough, maybe after millions of miles of digging and digging, we might end up reaching such a cave after all, another cave, and thereby proving at last that we are not alone in the universe. The probability is tiny, I know, given the infinite number of directions we could dig into, but that's all we know. It's all that anybody can know, so he argues. Such would be the enlightened prophecy of the philosopher in the cave, brothers and sisters, following that fundamentally sophist tradition of which Plato was so proud. Why would such be his theory? Because in his experience, all he or anybody knows for that matter has ever seen, digging into the rocks of the cave was more of the same. More rocks. Now, any healthy mind, untainted by the sophist ways of the Greeks, would say, we just don't know. We don't know what's beyond all these rocks. The honest answer is we have no answer. The only honest answer. We can't know what's beyond this cave. Nobody has ever been out of it to tell us. Okay? So unless someone comes in from outside, we will never know. We would, of course, only know that the creator of all this that we observe, of ourselves and of everything else, must be out there beyond it all. He must be mightier than all, more perfect than all, high above it all, and wiser than all. Okay? Without revealed knowledge from outside, that would be all that we can tell about what exists beyond the cave. It's not an infinite universe of rocks because it cannot be infinite. Aslan. Okay? A philosopher, however, would not in the least accept such an answer. What do you mean we don't know or we cannot know? Of course we can. I, the philosopher, am endowed with more wits and brains than most, and my mind tells me that since every time we dig anywhere around we find rock, then it follows rationally that rock is all there is outside of the cave. This is what our best science can tell us about reality. The fabric of reality would thus be a tightly arranged array of dust particles. Okay, dust and rock would be the matter from which all life emerged in this cave. The law of gravity would then be an infinite equivalent pull in one direction, the direction of the ground of the cave, because that's the direction that we see anything pulling anything at all. Everything pulls everything else in that single direction downwards to infinity below. Some other brilliant philosopher might then object at this point by saying, hey, this can't be true, because this would mean that the cave would have to collapse under its own weight eventually, if indeed there's only rock above it to infinity. And since we have no reason to believe that the world has ever begun to exist, then we shouldn't then we shouldn't exist at all if what you say is true. So how can we solve this pickle? Some brilliant philosopher would then propose another pulling force from above our heads, from above the cave, that keeps that from happening, that keeps that collapse from happening. Okay? And that's how it's always been. And keeps the infinite block of rock from collapsing onto this void that we live in, and any other void that might actually exist inside it, which of course would limit the physically possible places of other caves to exist in the horizontal plane where ours does, okay, in fact exist, because that would be the Goldilocks zone of caves, so to speak, in the midst of this dead infinity of rock all around, the place where gravitation is just right. This would be good news, because then the probability would slightly increase in finding other caves if we dig around in horizontal directions. An anthropic principle of sorts would thus emerge. Okay? We only happened to evolve in this cave because it just so happened to be in the right place within the bulk of infinite rocky universe. We can learn all about the nature of the universe by examining the natures and properties of those samples of rock and silt that we extract every now and then from holes in the walls of the cave or in its ground. If we could somehow reach the ceiling of the cave one day, well, that would be another story. And this would open up a whole new world of knowledge about the universe for us. Scientists of the world, let your imagination run wild. Okay? Our current theories could be changed one day, of course. We could dismiss a paradigm in favor of another, but the overall method remains the same, and it has to remain the same. The sacred tradition of the Greeks remains the same. This is how it all starts, and this is how it proceeds. Okay? It has to be this way, and no other, because, obviously, otherwise we would have to learn to accept the fact that we just don't know. There is nothing, however, that a philosopher hates more than having to say, I don't know. But let's hold it there and think about this for a moment, brothers and sisters. By what warrant are we justified in claiming that whatever law or regularity of matter and its natures appears to hold true here, in this limited part of the world that our accumulated human experience has uncovered thus far for us, must hold true of all existence, everywhere and at all times? On what grounds would such an assumption stand at all? On the grounds of us wishing it to be true? This fundamental fallacy in extrapolating induction and analogy to the extreme ends of the world, what epistemic warrant could it possibly have? When a physicist holds, for example, that The second law of thermodynamics is to be stated as such. For a spontaneous process, the entropy of the universe increases. The entropy of the universe increases. On what grounds is he justified in making such a bombastic claim? Yes, granted, all engines we've ever seen, and even more generally, all closed thermodynamic systems we've ever come across in our human experience have exhibited this tendency to thermal equilibrium that we call entropy. Things in contact with each other appear to absorb heat energy from each other until they've all reached a point where none of them has any excess heat to exchange with things in contact with it. Maximum entropy, that is, as we call it. But on what grounds are we to assume that the entire universe is, at large, a closed thermodynamic system? On what grounds should we assume that anywhere we go in the universe, entropy must be constantly rising? The only grounds I can think of, brothers and sisters, is the fact that if they did not make such an assumption, the law would then be incomplete. Okay, incomplete. Rationally incomplete? No. Of course not. There is clearly nothing irrational about assuming that a certain law only applies to a limited part of the universe, not to its entirety. After all, it's what the actual induction underlying the law really warrants us, right? The data we have only tells us that much. We've never been to the far end of the cosmos, have we? So what is it then? What is it then? What makes it a pressing necessity to make the law universal and all-encompassing in such a manner? Nothing but the Greek legacy of hubris, brothers and sisters. That's it. The know-it-all or nothing-at-all attitude of the enlightened genius in Plato's cave we've just sketched out for you. Okay? We know because we must know. Ask any cosmologist about the warrant for their presupposition of the cosmological principle, the uniformity principle, the homogeneity principle, isotropy and the likes, and the only answer you would ever get is that if they didn't presuppose such principles, there wouldn't be a science called cosmology at all. There couldn't. Okay? But that's not an epistemic warrant, brothers and sisters. That's little more than a pathetic excuse from a lousy child. I have to make noise because if I didn't, then who would yell? Who would you yell at, Daddy? Okay, if I didn't make noise, then who would you yell at? It's what children do, right? I'm a child, and I have to do that because I'm a child. Perhaps there really should be no such science at all as cosmology. Has it never occurred to you that this might, in fact, be the only honest stance to make here? Because I'm afraid it is. It's the only honest position. Any theory that a philosopher proposes about the cosmos at large will always be nothing more than wishful thinking. Any law that they assume to apply to all of space and all of time, like general relativity to name but one, will always stand upon nothing but wishful thinking. It has to encompass all of reality, because if the theory didn't, then those unfortunate folk from the church would then come out and say, see, you only know too little after all. Too little to claim the falsity of what our scripture teaches about reality. Furthermore, and that's the kicker here, you are all supposed to submit your minds and your souls to that scripture, the way we have chosen to do. Why? Because nowhere else would you find knowledge about the great beyond. And that's the deal breaker. Right there. Submission. That's what the entire tradition of metaphysical theory is really about, after all. Who submits to whom? The clergy or the academy? One party has to lead, and the other has to follow, obviously. Because those who have the keys to the heavens, epistemically speaking, have the hearts and souls of people in their hands. They lead people by their very souls. So the tradition was designed such that the philosopher is in such a dialogue would go, what? Submit? Me? The great scholar of high sciences about all of existence? What are you even talking about? You are the ones who are required to seek justification and grounds for your religious beliefs in my works, in my theories of all that exists. Come to me if you wish to learn anything of value about the unseen. That's how theology has been done for ages, in case you haven't noticed. It's how the academy works. And if you don't know that, go ask your pope. Go educate yourself. You people follow us. We don't follow you. We teach you about nature, existence, the natures of regularities governing all things that exist, and you take that knowledge and seek to establish belief in your Creator upon it somehow. Okay, by some argument that you come up with. All your revealed scripture is then to be reinterpreted to match the latest of our theories. Okay, this is the way it's always been. It never goes the other way. Okay? Now, this is how someone like Dawkins finds sheer, unquestionable, unbound authority in speaking about reality as such the way that he does. If it exists, if it is real at all, anything at all, whatever it is, then only through our best theory of science can it be shown to be so. Supernatural magic, as he labels it, is nothing but this fictional material of novels and entertainment works, like he mentioned in his quotation, in what we just quoted. Never mind that virtually all cultures of the world have had their own ancient traditions of practicing magic since time immemorial, mostly in harmful ways, that is. The Greek monopoly over reality and what can or cannot be real has left no room for any of this, so it all has to be little more than fairy tale. If the theory leaves no room for the idea of an event, any event happening without our induced laws of nature, whatever status they're at today, providing sufficient explanation for it, then it cannot have happened at all. It cannot have happened at all. This is the belief, guys. Dawkins is one of those people who would have no problem at all, not in the least, with explaining away supernatural events or apparitions that were reportedly witnessed by hundreds, if not thousands, of people simultaneously, as nothing but group hallucination. Group hallucination? By the thousands? Yeah. By the millions if he had to. No problem. That's the only explanation science can offer, so it is necessarily the truth. His faith cannot be shaken, not for a minute, in the falsity of any and all supernatural claims, any and all, wholesale. But on what grounds does he build such faith? So much faith, after all. What grounds? The same kind of petty grounds that the philosopher in the cave had for holding that ridiculous theory about the universe, brothers and sisters, the universe of rocks. Reality can only be a continuous, homogeneous, omnipresent repetition of the same kinds of matter, the same kinds of natures, and the same regularities that we have induced so far in our limited experience within the cave. It is thus everywhere, and it has always been thus from eternity past. It has to be so, not because we have warranted grounds upon which to build it, but because if it weren't so, then the academy would fall and the clergy would win. The clergy would win. There really is no grounds for such a blanket dismissal of any and all claims of supernatural magic, but blind faith from his part. The same kind he makes fun of all people of religion for committing. Although in his case the blind faith stands upon the most dishonest and unworthy grounds imaginable, the most ridiculous grounds imaginable, purely wishful thinking, the lame excuse of a lousy child. At least churchgoers have a book they claim to have reasons to believe it to be true revelation from the maker of the world, himself, the maker of everything, the one who knows everything. You, Dawkins, on the other hand, build your entire belief system upon a fallacy of generalization, one that flies in the face of reason itself, as I've elaborated earlier. So what a pathetic way to be. He says, supernatural magic is the kind of magic we find in myths and fairy tales, in miracles too, though I shall leave those to one side for now and return to them in the final chapter. Now, had he been an honest seeker of the truth, Dawkins, the best case Dawkins would endeavor to make here is that, to his knowledge, no case of actual supernatural magic has ever been reported scientifically. He would be right to say so, most probably, but it would not follow, however, that no such thing as supernatural magic exists or has ever happened at all. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, obviously. The claim he's making here, though, is much stronger. He's not claiming that that there is no evidence. Okay, it's not just that. Of course, he builds his claim and his faith upon that claim, but that's not the case, really. He's claiming supernatural magic is and can only be the kind of magic we find in myths, okay, as in false tales embraced by people from different cultures. That's what he means by myths here, and fairy tales. It's the stuff of myth, okay. It cannot be real. Look at the lengths he goes to make it look as ridiculous an idea as one can imagine. He goes on to say, it's the magic of Aladdin's lamp, of wizard spells, of the Brothers Grimm, of Hans Christian Andersen, and of J.K. Rowling. It's the fictional magic of a witch casting a spell and turning a prince into a frog, or a fairy godmother changing a pumpkin into a gleaming coach. These are the stories we all remember with fondness from our childhood, and many of us still enjoy when serving up in a traditional Christmas pantomime. But we all know this kind of magic is just fiction and does not happen in reality. Oh, we do? We all know that? Based on what exactly? If I may ask. That you have reasons to believe it to be impossible? Okay, the way I see it, this is the only argument you can put forth, since the only proper position you should take, if all you had to support your position was lack of scientific evidence, is to withhold judgment, right? That's what your strict scientism or extreme positivism would require. So it's either rational impossibility or physical impossibility that you're holding that you're holding here, that you're committing yourself to. There can be no third route for you here, obviously. Now let's take the most ridicule-inspiring example of the stories you mentioned here: a prince turning into a frog under the effect of a spell spoken by someone. All right. Now, in order for this instance to be shown to be rationally impossible, you would have to extract a contradiction, either in the phrase itself, as I wrote it, or in something that it entails. Obviously, there is none to be shown here. Okay, no contradictions, so it's not rationally impossible. So what about physical impossibility? Is there even such a thing? Is there even such a thing at all? By physical impossibility, we can only mean that the physical laws we've induced and experienced thus far would not allow something like this to happen at all, ever. But what is a physical law in the first place? What is it? And what does it really mean for such a law to allow or disallow anything in reality? What's the ontological status of a physical law? All right. A law of physics is, simply put, the statement we make about certain natures of things we've experienced in our accumulated experience over the years as humans. Natures here is in reference to the way things are observed to behave under certain conditions, such that whenever those conditions repeat, the nature is expected to obtain. However, as you can see, by its very nature, the nature of matter or of anything that we observe is but a counterfactual of contingency. A counterfactual of contingency. An if conditional. If certain conditions hold, then the nature should hold, as usually happens most of the time. Fire burns when it touches one's hand, but it is not a rational necessity that it should always do that. It's but a counterfactual conditional, meaning that it can be conceived of certain conditions wherein a flame wouldn't burn a man's hand. Some flames have indeed been created in the lab that don't burn at all. Okay? Now, what a strict naturalist would do here is attempt to explain such conditions for a certain physical regularity to hold in all their possible manifestations and iterations in terms of laws of nature that we currently know. Why? Not because observation and induction tells us that it has to be so, but because the naturalist operates under methodological naturalism, the belief that all causes must be natural, and thus all scientific hypotheses must be natural. And by natural, they mean familiar to us, through human experience. There can be no room in those conditions for supernatural causes. In those conditions, there can be no room for supernatural causes. Nothing can be supernatural or supranatural or something above nature or out of nature. That can't happen. Everything must be reduced to things we've previously induced from our accumulated experience with the world, whatever it happens to be like. This, however, is a reductionist attitude at best, and an appeal to ignorance at worst, an appeal to familiarity. Not all events must have causes that we're familiar with necessarily, and it's never the case that such are the only causes for anything that happens. It is an article of blind faith that they should be so. The world is way too big, and causal connections under our experience are way too complex for such a claim to make any sense or hold any epistemic worth. We are only justified in assuming some natures to be parts of the causal network underlying a certain event, but not all of it, not all of the network. Okay, so am I suggesting that certain words, if spoken in certain order, can result in particular physical effects as a matter of law or causal regularity? I certainly believe that to be the case as a Muslim, but that's not what I'm arguing here. This is to be established on scripture, obviously, not on rational argumentation. Rather, I'm arguing that there is no force, ontologically speaking, in any law of physics we know of or we could potentially learn about in the future that should prevent this from ever being the case. That's what I'm arguing here. Okay? Words we humans speak obviously do have physical effects. They create a mechanical wave in the medium we speak them into. So why is it so unthinkable that other physical effects can be obtained as a matter of causal regularity from particular words or signs if spoken in a certain manner or a certain order under certain conditions? It's not the kind of regularity that we're familiar with in our everyday life, obviously, that's granted, but there can be no physical reason, no physical or rational reason to believe them not to be possible. Okay, to believe them not to be possible. Okay? Perhaps some of those regularities do in fact correlate into certain natures or laws that we currently know of, one way or another, in ways we simply cannot fathom. Okay, maybe they operate by a set of natures that come from a parallel world to our own, the world of the jinn, that we learn about from scripture, none of which we're familiar with, of course. The point here is that if by supernatural you mean something that is not the product of natures of things we currently know of through induction, then by no means does this imply that they can be nothing but myth and fiction. There was a time not long ago, in fact, only a few decades ago, when the idea of a smartphone, for example, would have been considered supernatural or magic by many people. Go back a few centuries farther, and you would find people thinking the same way about flying in the air on aircraft. Okay, flying in the air. We really know so little about the world. Oh, so very little, despite the philosopher insisting that he knows it all. A law of causes, or a causal regularity, natural or otherwise, is only binding insofar as the entire set of causal conditions are conducive to it. There is, and can be, no epistemic access for the humankind to the entire network of such conditions, not even most of it, just the few parts of it that fall within our direct accumulated sensual experience, the reach of our senses, as a humankind, as accumulated reach, okay? The accumulated experience of all humans. We need to be brave enough and honest enough to admit this. Mathematical expressions of physical laws are simply our linguistic expression of regular correlations between different observable natures. They are not the regularities themselves, but our mental simulation of the very little that we observe of the network of causes, the way that it works, and the way that it works. They do not bind or command submission from reality, as Neoplatonist thinkers of our time would seem to believe. So unless you believe, as a matter of blind faith, in strict physical determinism, or natural causal closure, that is, which is by all means a statement of ignorance and childish hubris, only the kinds of causes I'm familiar with can exist, unless you believe that, you would have no reason to dismiss such causes being amongst the kinds of conditions that could block one or more of our natural laws, or natural laws as we know them, from taking effect in some cases, much less exhibit such dismissal in so much scorn as in Dawkins's words. Now, the best that a naturalist would commit himself to here in response is basically an appeal to absence of evidence. But again, this is defeated by pointing out that absence of evidence is simply a state of ignorance. It's a statement of ignorance. You are saying that you don't know. You don't know. And that's all you can afford to say. So call it by its name, okay? Don't be so presumptuous as to claim knowing that something like that, a man turning into a frog, for example, cannot happen just because it would break the laws of nature as you know them if it did. Now, there might be other reasons why such a transformation, a stunning transformation cannot happen, but definitely not because they would break the laws of nature. No. Of course they can be broken. There is no rational grounds in believing they cannot, except for the Greek hubris that we are here to warn against. There can only be more rock wherever you dig around the cave to infinity in all directions, because that's what our best science tells us. But that's really not science at all, as I hope you can clearly see now. It's not but the wishful belief of a defiant child at best. Wallahu musta'an, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.
قناة إقناع فيما نرجو.
سحابة خير أمطرت على أرض جرداء،
تحمل من كل زوجين اثنين،
المؤمن والملحد،
الضال والمهتدي،
الموقن والشاك،
فأنبتت بما تحمله من ماء الحياة، حيث نصوص الوحيين
ثمار اليقين في قلوب المؤمنين،
وصقلت بذات الماء قلوب المعاندين.